Welcome to the All Creatures Podcast. This is Chris. Today, a spectacular guest, a fellow podcaster that I chased down. I'm gonna tell you how I chased him down here in a minute. But I want to welcome Thomas Rhillstone, who is the host of the History of Aotearoa New Zealand podcast. Hey, welcome, Thomas.
G'day. Yeah, thank you for inviting me on and chasing me down. Yes, you did.
Yeah.
So that was very nice of you. Yeah, thank you for inviting me on and come chat about animals in New Zealand and that kind of stuff.
Yeah, it's a funny story. So I just ran across your podcast, and as a fellow podcaster, you like to listen to others and not only give ideas, but I always like to is the audio quality good? Are we comparable and things like that? And your podcast really hooked me quickly. It very well done. Your episode 1, 2, 3. Superior, great job compared to ours. Ours is, me and Angie go, start episode 15, 20 with us.
But yeah, thank you for all that praise. It means a lot for, I guess, as a podcaster, you don't tend to get a lot of feedback from the audience. So it's nice when, it's very validating when people are like, hey, I listened to the podcast and I think it's really good. And you're like, oh, thank God, I'm not the only one listening to it. So,
it is
so
great.
That's nice.
It's really great. It's really great. And we're going to get into it today, especially New Zealand. And what got me about Thomas, just to set this up for our listeners, is not only is it the history of the country, but it's natural history. Because what caught me, and I was like, you were talking about, you had a Tuatara episode, and when the Māori came and how that impacted the environment, and you had just such a different take on it. And I was just like, I need to get this guy on my podcast. I have to. And I told Angie, I was like, because normally we have everybody chasing us down now to come on our podcast. I was like, no, I'm going after Thomas. So thank you for coming on. And just to kick this off, can you just kind of give our listeners your background? I mean, obviously you grew up here in New Zealand, but what really, I guess growing up, what really drew you into nature?
So as you say, my podcast is history based, and it's got this kind of weird natural history kind of bend to it, I guess, if you want to call it that. And that's because, my background is in zoology and genetics specifically. So if anyone wants to know the specifics, I have a Bachelor of Science from the University of Otago, majoring in zoology and minoring in genetics. Don't know why that was so difficult for me to get out. I've got the thing literally on my wall right here.
Yes.
And I should know that. So I studied at the University of Otago doing that, which was, all about animals and that sort of stuff. But prior to that, I'd always liked biology at high school when I was in Invercargill. I grew up in the deep south, New Zealand deep south, not America's deep south.
No.
They are very similar though. In a lot
they
of respects.
They are.
So that's one thing. But so when I was in Invercargill and when I was at high school, I did enjoy biology quite a lot, and that's, I guess, kind of where it started. And then I got to uni. I started out doing genetics as a major, and then realized actually I'm not super good at that because it requires a lot of biochemistry. that's very hard.
None of us are.
I found. So that was the only paper I ever failed was biochem. And in my second semester, I did a really condensed zoology class where they went through all the different phylums and stuff. And that was it. You just had to remember all the different phylums. And in hindsight, that was actually really horrible. But at the time, I was like, actually, this is really interesting. I really, really like the sound of this. So that's when I switched, and I was like, the zoology I think is the thing I want to do. And so that's where it really kicked off, is when I did that paper and I decided I wanted to continue doing that. And so then I did that for uni, and then of course you get to the end of uni and you go, well, what do I do with my life now? Took a year to figure that one out until someone gave me a job in an aquarium, which was in Picton, and I worked there for 2 years, looking after primarily fish, as you might imagine, as an aquarium does. So things like snapper, hāpuka, which is groper. We had carpet sharks, blue cod, one trevally, tarakihi. But we also had things like starfish and tuatara, which is where I learned a lot about those. We had some red-crowned kakariki. We also had some yellow-crowned kakariki, which we bred for Project Janzoon, which is a big project in Abel Tasman National Park. And so I did that for a couple of years, and then someone else gave me a job here in Wellington, and I am still currently doing that job, which all I'll say about that is I am in conservation, specifically in trapping. So trying to trap rats and possums and stoats and all sorts of other things to try and save the biodiversity that New Zealand has, which it was a very sort of 180 kind of heel turn of being like, yeah, I'm actively trying to keep animals alive, and now it's like, now I'm actively trying to kill animals to keep other animals alive, but actively trying to kill animals. So,
yeah, I know.
Which is an interesting twist.
Yeah. Yeah.
So that's kind of where I guess my background in kind of conservation and nature and that sort of stuff comes from.
Well, to be honest with you, nobody's good at genetics, even the geneticists. So don't worry about it. It's after doing so many genetic projects and actually publishing scientific articles on genetics, you fall behind so quickly in that field. It is such an incredibly fast moving field. So don't worry about that. But I'm glad you found your love.
I did finish the minor, so that was something.
That's good.
But I pretty quickly realized, I don't know if I want to do this as like the thing that I do. I realized actually animals are pretty cool, and I just like animals and learning about animals, and that became my thing. So and that's worked out pretty well so far. So
well, and we're going to talk a lot about this because we're especially going to talk about the impacts of humans on New Zealand. I guess the first thing we should say is, what's Aotearoa? Because people hear that and they're like, okay, what does that mean? So
so it's Aotearoa. I don't mean to bag the
my
accent,
American,
but
it's the American. It's all right.
So Aotearoa is Te Reo Māori, which is the Māori language. So Māori are the indigenous peoples of New Zealand. So they were here first. And they basically, Aotearoa is what they, depending on who you ask, was at some point named, was basically the name for New Zealand. And it literally translates to Land of the Long White Cloud, which is in reference to basically the story, the kind of Māori story of how New Zealand was discovered, which was by Kupe, who came over here chasing a giant octopus, Te Whiki, because he was really annoyed at him. And in doing so, he discovered New Zealand. Or I should say, everyone gives him credit, says Kupe discovered New Zealand. It was actually his wife. She was the one who first spotted it. So technically she should get the credit. And that whole thing was about the fact that she spotted a long white cloud above the horizon, which is a common indication that land is underneath it. So you see the clouds before you see the land when you're sailing around on boats and stuff. And so she saw that cloud and went, oh, there's land, Aotearoa. We found the land of the long white cloud, which is a real thing that Polynesian wayfarers and that sort of stuff, and I assume probably European shipmen as well, they also use that to spot land when they're trying to find land and that sort of stuff. So that's all kind of cool, and how that it kind of all ties together, like a real actual seafaring technique with a story and what New Zealand is named and that sort of stuff. But yeah, basically it's the Te Reo Māori name for New Zealand. Yeah.
And then New Zealand came from
from a bit later. It was 1670 something or other. I can't quite remember the exact date. But that was Abel Tasman. He was a Dutch explorer? ?
Yes. Exploiter. Oh, sorry. No.
Yeah. He worked for the VOD, which was the Dutch East India Company. And he was basically going out to try and find land to, exploit. The VOD were notorious for, they were a company. They wanted to make money. And so his job was going out and trying to find places that would have good resources for them to use and exploit and sell and all that sort of stuff. So that was kind of what he was up to. And so he came along, and he was from the Netherlands, and he saw New Zealand. And I don't know if he called it New Zealand at the time. He didn't realize what New Zealand was. He thought New Zealand and Australia were connected to what at the time was known as Terra Australis. which was this kind of weird, massive landmass that a lot of European like scientists and scholars thought was kind of on the opposite side of the globe. And what actually ended up being was Antarctica. They were right. Antarctica was around. They were just very wrong about where it was and how it was all connected. And so he actually thought New Zealand was like kind of connected to Terra Australis, which obviously he was wrong. So New Zealand comes from his time down here, which he named it after, I guess you could call Old Zealand, which is I think it's a province in the Netherlands. So that's kind of where that comes from. It's basically just like, you've got New York. Here
New
we've
Orleans,
got and here we've got New Plymouth.
Yes.
So it's all. So it sounds really cool when you're like, oh, New Zealand. Actually, it's just that super dumb naming scheme that Europeans had for a while. Just taking a name that was already in existence and just adding new in front of it. Which is I think is as good an argument as any that we should just change it to Aotearoa, because I think New Zealand is kind of boring.
It is. But it is this mystical place that we're going to get to. Real quick, you did say papers, and for our American audience and others, that's a course. So when you took a course, paper in... No.
That's probably going to happen a few times throughout.
No, it's all good. I'll try to Americanize it, for our audience, because that's something I learned. I'm like, what's the heck's a paper? I'm like, I wrote papers, but yeah. So just to get that out of the way. This land is fascinating. So, I feel very, very fortunate to live here and call New Zealand home. It's just, I don't know. It's just a mystical place. And I beg our audience, we have many listeners here in New Zealand and in Australia, but, those outside of here to come visit, please come visit. It's just such a beautiful place to visit. But what inspired you? Okay, so you're a naturalist, because we're going to get into your conservation work and, the impacts on the species here. But what inspired you to start a history podcast?
Yeah, which is, I guess, a weird combination that I still get questions about, even from my workmates. When we hire a new person and I go, oh, g'day, my name's Thomas, how's it going? And then they go, oh yeah, and you kind of get chatting to them about like what you do outside of work. And I go, oh yeah, so I my background's in zoology and I do a history podcast in my spare time. And they're like, weird. It doesn't meet, that doesn't seem to make sense. So it's a natural question. I guess it goes. I've also had an interest in history for quite some time. I had a fantastic history teacher at high school, and arguably, if he wasn't as good as he was, I would not be doing the podcast at all. Because he was fantastic. I really, really enjoyed his classes, and then I went to uni, and I decided I didn't want to do history, partially because every person I talked to said, don't do history at uni because the high school teachers' classes are so good, history will be ruined for you. Because the professors at uni will just suck. And I was like, okay, don't do that then. So I didn't, and then I didn't really do anything history related for quite some time. As you tend to do at uni, you tend to focus on that pretty hard. And then after I finished uni, I really wanted to... Something I kind of discovered about myself was I really liked learning, just in general. I like knowing stuff, and that's really that's easy to do when you're in high school and you're at uni, and then you get out of uni and you go, okay, now I guess I get a job, work for 40 years, and then I die. And so I was kind of like, well, I kind of still want to learn stuff. I don't want to stagnate. So I discovered history podcasts. Because I was kind of like, I want to do history things again. I want to learn things about history that I don't know. And so I discovered history podcasts as a really convenient way of walking to work. I learned something for half an hour, and then, hey, I've learned something today. That's pretty cool. And so I did that for a few years, and that was really good. I discovered a lot of really cool history podcasts, some of which I now have like been on and stuff. So that's kind of fun. And I, at some point, I was like, it'd be great to know about New Zealand. I've learned about England, I've learned about France, I've learned about America, and that's fine. But it'd be really cool to know some more about New Zealand history. New Zealand history is not something, at least when I was at school, was not something that was taught. And so I went out and was like, sure, someone has got to have had this idea before. Someone has surely seen things like The History of Rome by Mike Duncan, which is generally considered to be the history podcast that spawned all others.
Yeah.
And I was like, someone has got to have seen that and gone, let's do that for New Zealand. We're a big enough country that's surely out of the 4 to 5-ish million people that we have, someone else has thought of this. Turns out no. Yeah. Or at least if they hadn't done anything about it. And so I sat around for a year being like, that's kind of a bit of a bugger. Yeah, and at one point I just went, well, you know what? Bugger it. I'll do it. If no one else is going to do it, then I'll do it myself. And so that's kind of where that came from. Was I really liked history, wanted to learn more about New Zealand history, and no one else was doing it. So I decided to do it myself, which is still something I occasionally ask, was that a good idea?
Do it for love, that's for sure.
Yeah, no, it's sometimes when you're looking at like everything that you have to cover and you just go, oh boy, what did I get myself into?
Yep. Like after this interview, I need to edit. I need to get this editing.
It's not even just that stuff. It's just literally, I remember quite early on, I decided I was going to just have a flick through. I've got like a few books of like general New Zealand history that goes from basically the start to the end, right? And so I just had a flick through. I was like, oh yeah, so what kind of things am I going to have to cover? And I was like, oh my God, there is there's a lot of it, and very complicated and very nuanced, and there's a lot going on. Oh boy, this is going to be hard. But that's okay. Personally, I think nothing ever worth doing was easy. No. So it was kind of like, it's an interesting challenge, I guess is the way I'd describe it.
That's how we started. I mean, back in 2017, it was looking at like there was no animal really podcasts out there, and we were both scientists, and we said, well, let's try it, see what happens, and then you don't know what you're getting yourself into. And
I mean, the same. It's the same for everyone. Every single history podcast that I've talked to, and particularly ones that have kind of come to me and like have said, I've listened to your podcast, I want to start my own. We all go through the same thing of going, this will be great. I'll cover this event in 3 episodes, and that'll be it. Ends up taking like 20, and you've spent half a year on it, and you just it all just gets blown out, which is great. That's kind of the cool thing. It's nice to be able to have lots of.
What you're 80 episodes in now? You just
85, I think, as of last week.
I'm getting the notifications on my phone now, and I got to catch up. I'm at the beginning, and you're still like at the beginning almost.
Yes, So where I currently am is the goal was to start before humans arrived, and the end goal was the year 2000 CE. Right, the year 2000, because you have to draw a cutoff at some point, and that's where I decided to draw mine because it was a nice round number. Basically, no other reason than that. And it was really, really important to me that I talk about Māori and what they were up to before Europeans arrived. Although I said before that I didn't have any history sort of teaching when I was at school, that is a slight lie. There was a little bit, but it was all related to people like James Cook or the Treaty of Waitangi or that sort of stuff. All really quite important to the history of New Zealand, but also like that's post-European, right? That's when Europeans have turned up and they're doing stuff. There wasn't really anything about what Māori were up to prior to Europeans, hitting our shores, basically. Yeah. And so that was really important to me to cover Māori, their culture, and that sort of stuff, in the sense that this is quite unknown knowledge if you're not going to look for it. But also it's important to the story, in the sense that it's starting from either Abel Tasman or James Cook is really only half the story, because you don't know why Māori are responding to Cook in certain ways unless you have kind of got that background. Like, one of the first things that happened to Cook was he landed in modern Gisborne, and a group of Māori men were giving him a wero, which is like it kind of translates to a challenge. They were standing there with their weapons, they were kind of jumping around, they were sticking their tongue out, widening their eyes and all this sort of stuff. To most Māori, this would be recognised as a wero. This would be recognised as a non-hostile challenge, just basically being like, we don't know who you are, but we're going to show off our weapons and our muscles and how strong we are, so that if you get the idea that you're going to mess around, you know that you're in for some trouble. Cook's crew did not understand this, obviously. And so there was an altercation where a couple of people died and this sort of stuff. And so if you don't know why Māori were doing that it doesn't really gel together of why Cook and Māori were responding to each other in the way that they were, because they didn't understand each other and that sort of thing. So covering Māori was really, really important to me for that reason, and for, it's really under-taught and all that sort of stuff, as well as the fact it's just interesting. It's just really interesting about, what were they doing? How did they survive in a new land? They came from the tropical Pacific and now they've come to the, South Pacific. Yeah. It's a lot colder here than it is in, say, like Fiji or Tahiti, which is where they think they came from. And so, like, that's all really interesting as well, is kind of the challenges that they faced in coming to a place that was very, very different to what they were used to. So with all that said, to answer your question, I'm not even up to Abel Tasman. I'm still in pre-European kind of Māori culture. I'm covering things like their social kind of structure, things that they were weaving, what were they carving, which was a big part of their culture, and like the food, what were they eating? And games. One of the most recent ones that I've done is like their, not just things that they were doing to survive, but also things like what were they doing for fun? What kind of games were they playing? What kind of board games were they playing? And all that sort of stuff. So, kind of just covering the culture and what kind of life was like if you were transported sort of 800 to sort of 400-ish years ago. What would, if you were a person living in pre-European New Zealand, what sort of things would you expect to be doing, basically? It's fascinating.
It's fascinating. It drew me in. And what we're going to start getting into is the impacts on the ecology here, because I'm listening to your stories about the Maori and the different expansion between the North Island, South Island, all that stuff. But how they survived here. You're right. Like, from personal experience, I moved from Florida in the United States to New Zealand, and that was like subtropical hot to absolute freezing winter. I think now I'm used to it. It's not that bad, but how did they do it? What did they eat? So we're going to get to there. Yeah. To start off, I guess, to start telling this story, and I've alluded to this to some of our podcasts, and I talked a little bit about it with our Kākāpō that we just did recently. What makes New Zealand so unique? Why is our biome so unique here?
Yeah, so a lot of it, I guess, really comes down to the isolation. New Zealand broke off from Gondwana land and what would become Australia really, really early on. I don't have the specific number here, but it was really early on in comparison to a lot of other kind of land masses in the world. And so there was a very short window between when sort of birds and all sorts of other things could really get from the main land mass that would eventually become everywhere else and to little New Zealand. And then once it got further enough away, that was it. Basically, nothing else could get here. It was really, really rare for things to get here. And so it really comes down to the isolation as kind of the main sort of factor there, is animals were just so isolated that they evolved in very weird and wonderful ways. And it's a similar sort of situation with Australia having all these very interesting and weird and exceptionally deadly animals. For some reason, New Zealand didn't go that way. No. We don't really have anything that can kill you just by biting you or anything like that, which is much better, really. But so that's kind of, I guess, the crux of it is there's just stuff here that's not really been disturbed for a really long time, hasn't really had much migration from other places generally. And so the stuff that hasn't really been able to migrate out or in just kind of sat here and did weird stuff.
Yeah.
And so that's how we end up with things like Kākāpō, which are really stinky, and that sort of thing. And I guess as part of that is we don't have very many mammals. We have 2/3 species of bats. That's the only mammals that we have in New Zealand, at least native mammals.
Native, yeah.
And so that's really weird in most, in the context of most areas. Even Australia, our closest sort of neighbour, is just inundated with mammals. Has heaps of mammals. Whereas, New Zealand just has basically 3.
Bats.
Two extant, one extinct.
Yeah.
And so that's really, really unique. As well as one of the other sort of unique things is all penguin species in the world can be traced back to New Zealand, which is really exciting, which I think you might have mentioned on your Little Blue Penguin podcast.
Yeah. We had the giant penguin that was like 6 feet tall or something.
So lots of big penguins and that sort of thing, which is which is where penguins basically came from, is New Zealand, which is kind of a fun thing, So that's kind of, and I guess the other thing would be a lot of the plants and animals are really, really ancient. To call them ancient is not exactly, I realize, scientifically correct.
No.
But for the lay people, they'll understand what I mean. It's, a lot of these species have not changed for a very, very long time. Tuatara is the kind of poster child of that. But even the plants, a lot of our like podocarps and stuff, have not changed for a number of millions of years. Which is kind of one of the first episodes that I did, I called The Land That Time Forgot, because kind of New Zealand is kind of like that, at least when you go into those sort of pristine kind of native forests, is it is really like stepping back in time to, kind of when the dinosaurs were around.
Yeah.
There's all these weird big tree ferns and that sort of stuff. And it feels very odd if you're not kind of if that's not your backyard, then that's a weird thing. And so so that's kind of also what makes it very interesting, is there's a lot of species here that just have not changed at all, and some that have changed a lot in lots of weird ways.
No, it's good. It's good. You captured it perfectly. I mean, it is the land that time forgot. I mean, when you do go on treks and you're walking through and you see all the ferns up in the trees and, up on the branches, everything all the growth up there, you really feel like you are in the age of dinosaurs. I mean, you really do. It's
something that my partner, who's from North Carolina, she said when she first came to New Zealand which was really weird for her, was she saw a big tree fern, huge tree fern, and she looked at it and went, oh, it must be a big tree that's got like a weird sort of parasitic fern on the top. And whoever she was with at the time was like, oh, no, that's all one. Yeah, that's one organism. That's a tree fern. It's a tree that is a fern. And she was just, her mind was blown, just because you don't really get that anywhere else. It's for me, that's really the big sort of like, that's what you see in those old kind of dinosaur sort of docos, is these big trees that have got these big ferns and stuff. And you see these big sort of brontosaurus-y type things eating from these ferns. And that sort of stuff. And that to me is like, that's just, I'll just pop down the road and there's one of them right there,
Yep. Well, and I mean, what makes it interesting is New Zealand was almost like one of the last habitable places for humans. It was the last place in the world that or the last major landmass that humans ended up kind of colonizing. Māori didn't get here until the sort of mid 13th century, so that's really late. In comparison to a lot of other areas, if you think of all the things that are happening in, say, Europe in the 13th century, in the 1200s, there's a lot, going on. And even in like Japan, China, there's heaps going on around the world in the 13th century, when Māori are basically just turning up and going, this is great. Let's live here, And so, so it was a really, really late addition to the human game, if you will. Well, and it was. And so you had this. So I always like to, when I go out and walk around, and I was just trying to imagine, pre-Maori times and just the pristine Aotearoa before, I'll say it right, Aotearoa I'll say it right. I will get there.
It's a hard one.
It is.
Which is, a lot of people have told me you should try and imagine it if you're trying to speak French. Do the vowels like you're trying to speak French.
Oh God.
Which people, I've had mixed responses. Whether people are like, "Oh, that really helps," and some people are like, "That does not help me at all. That's too much to think about."
I grew up near Mexico, so Spanish is my second language. No, so I walk around and you just imagine this pristine thing or pristine landmass, and then humans show up, and the Maori. I mean, beautiful culture. Please listen to his podcast. It really is engrossing, and it's a part of human history that is fascinating, and everybody needs to listen to it. But could we talk about the impact they had? And a lot of it I would say indigenous people, especially coming from the Americas, they take care of their environment. They respect it. It's not this mass European bulldoze, and that's all my ancestry, and I can comment on that. So when the Maori came, they weren't looking to bulldoze the land, but they actually did almost, right? I mean, they had this huge impact.
Yeah. So I guess the one kind of, misconception with a lot of human history is what you find is that there's a lot of megafauna in various places. So you're talking like woolly mammoths and giant sloths and all that stuff. Humans discover this place and they start setting up settlements and all that sort of stuff. And a few thousand years later, the megafauna's gone because that's the obvious food source. And New Zealand is very much part of that rule. Is people turn up, realize there's a lot of great eating, and they really go ham on it, and then discover, oh crap, all of that's gone now.
Yeah.
So the big impact that they had was the one that everyone talks about is the extinction of the moa, which was New Zealand's megafauna, or at least one species would be classed as megafauna. Most of the species range from sort of like a large dog to a kind of a cat size. But the one that everyone talks about is the one that's like 2.5 meters tall, and it was like 230 kgs or something. It's
massive.
Huge. And that's the one that the Haast eagle would eat and all that sort of stuff. So that one was the kind of major, or the most obvious and the most famous extinction after Māori arrived. Was they were hunted to extinction, partially just by pure hunting, catching them, eating them, that sort of stuff. But also they were doing a lot of burning of forested areas, partially to flush out those moa and the other bird species that they were trying to hunt as well. So there were things like adzebill, and I don't know if they were eating the laughing owl, but the laughing owl also went extinct before Europeans arrived, and that sort of thing. So there was I think there was something like 40-ish bird species that went extinct before Europeans arrived. And they Māori burned about 40% of New Zealand's kind of bush, if you will, again, prior to European arrival. And so they were doing that to hunt animals, to try and flush them out. Grassland is much easier to hunt in than dense forest. The other thing that they were doing was they were trying to clear land for kind of quote-unquote farmland. I put that in quotes because it wasn't farms on the kind of scale that you'd see Europeans doing even in the 13th century, but they were using them as like gardens to grow things like kumara, taro, yams, and aruhe was a big one as well, which is fern root. They weren't growing that specifically, but they were trying to kind of encourage that to grow. And so so part of it was farmland as well. And then there's things like penguins. A lot of those, you were talking about those large penguins, they went extinct. I don't know if they think whether it was purely hunting or whether it was also a combination of a few different things like climate change and stuff. But the hunting certainly didn't help. Again, there are large, bird species, but some of them were as tall as a person, 6 foot. So, that's again an obvious food source.
Yeah.
As well as things like seals were a big food source as well. So you had a lot of, although things like seals and penguins didn't necessarily go extinct entirely like they did with the moa, because they can escape into the water and that sort of stuff. You do see like local extinctions in certain areas we know seals used to exist here they don't anymore because they were hunted to local extinction, and that sort of stuff. So there was kind of that active hunting of certain animals. And then there was the introduction of things as well. So I talked about like kumara and that sort of thing. They're exotic plants that they brought to New Zealand. And some of them escaped out into the wild, and that has an impact. You know, they also brought kuri, which is the Pacific dog. So they brought dogs for hunting. They use them for that, but also, you know, companionship. People like dogs. It's been like that forever. It's not just you that you likes a beagle. You know, everyone liked their dog throughout history. So there was that as well. So obviously, you know, introduction of dogs has an impact. And the other one, of course, was the kiore, the Pacific rat, which was unintentional, obviously. No one brings rats because they like them. But obviously also that has an impact of, you know, rats are prolific breeders. They're really good at exploiting nearly every single niche that's ever existed. And so they did a lot of damage as well of, you know, as I said before, there was a combination of things that probably made the penguins go extinct, and that was one of them, was the eggs being predated upon by the Pacific rat. So kind of with all that said, I feel like I should say that although Māori did do quite a lot of damage to New Zealand, it absolutely is dwarfed by the industrial scale that Europeans
that's the next one.
did it. So we'll go into that in a minute. But just before anyone is like, oh my God, like he's really laid into them. No, what Māori did is just so small time compared to what Europeans were doing when they got here is just insane.
Well, you're talking 500-600 years before Europeans arrive, and then the European impact has only been the last 170-ish years. Roughly. And,
so there's also the scale, right? Māori had a lot longer to kind of hang around and do stuff. Europeans were very industrial. You know, they've achieved, in terms of habitat destruction, they have achieved a lot more in a lot less time.
And you're talking today, close to 40-something% of our native birds are endangered, you know, or heading towards extinction, which out of 400 and something, where, you know, the Maori did have an impact. It was interesting you were talking about that, because I was thinking of American Indians, you know, where I grew up, and their history, and you're right, like that is when the megafauna in North America started disappearing, is when the early humans were settling across the plains, hunting them, driving them off cliffs, you know, burning the prairie, everything to hunt meat. And so humans do have an impact everywhere. I was just very surprised, like the impact the Maori had. And it's again, your podcast, that was the fascinating, where I just was like, wow. So I'm really glad we get to talk about that. So now let's talk about the big boot that shows up, and you can probably tell more stories than I can. You know, learning about the introduction of stoats and rabbits, and why do I have European starlings here, and all these birds that
I know the specific answer to that one, actually. Starlings.
So let's go.
So starlings were introduced because they wanted to use them to eat the insects that were eating crops, the European crops. That's why they were brought over specifically. And of course, that didn't happen. The starlings, like most other introduced species to New Zealand, realized actually I can get a better meal somewhere else, and do so. And I think they ended up eating some of the crops as well. That was part of what they decided. You know, what they discovered was, actually, this is good eating. So they were brought over for, I don't want to say a good reason, but it was a reason that was much better than most of the others. Things like you see, like rabbits. Rabbits were brought over, and this is a theme that comes up a lot. Is they were brought over because the English, who were like sort of the primary colonizing group, wanted New Zealand to feel more like England. They wanted to feel like they were at home, which is I've always found really strange, because a lot of the reason that people came over to New Zealand, like they came to America when America was being colonized, was to get away from Europe, because they didn't like Europe for various reasons. So the first thing they did, they go, let's bring some rabbits over so we can make it more like the place we just tried to escape. So I never really understood that. So that's why rabbits were brought over, and then rabbits were breeding like rabbits, and were everywhere. and they started ruining all of the farmland that the Europeans were trying to farm by burrowing underneath the ground and that sort of stuff. So they thought, well, how are we going to solve this? We can't shoot this many rabbits. There's too many of them. So they thought, why don't we bring rabbits' natural predator, which is stoats. And I thought, that's a great idea. Let's bring the stoats over. The stoats will eat the rabbits, and then problem solved. This has a number of problems. For starters, they clearly did not understand the idea that every ecosystem has an equilibrium. The stoats aren't going to wipe out the rabbits. The stoats will at some point drop that population to a point where their population drops, and then the rabbit population will increase because there's less predation. So the stoat population increases, and then it keeps going like that. That's just how that works. So the plan from the get-go was already a crap one. But just like the starlings, the stoats kind of learned, actually, there's no point chasing those rabbits, which are very, very difficult to get, and very, you have to chase them, and they're very fast and all that stuff. Why don't I go and basically attack the Kākāpō that is sitting on his eggs, because he can't fight back, and he's very easy to kill, and additionally, he's very stinky, as I mentioned earlier, because
easy to find,
because the main predators in New Zealand were birds, so things like the Haast eagle, Kākāpō, the New Zealand falcon, and that kind of stuff. Birds are very good at seeing. Their eyesight is very good. So if you can hide from visually, you have a better chance of not being eaten. That's why tuatara sit still all the time, is because if you sit still, if you move around, you're more likely to be seen. If you sit still, you're less likely to be seen. And if you've got green skin like you do with the tuatara, that's even better. And so being stinky for the Kākāpō for millions of years did not matter. No one was trying to sniff them out. Stoats, though, they don't have... Well, actually, I don't know what their eyesight's like, but their primary form of hunting and tracking things is olfactory, is smell. So if you've got a really stinky Kākāpō, he's going to smell that right out, and he's going to keep chasing you. And the other kind of part of that is, of course, if you are like a tuatara and you stop when you're scared, because if you stop, you're less likely to be seen, the stoat isn't going to care. He's just going to run straight up to you and just go for you. So that was the big problem with stoats, was they very rapidly kind of started going after all the native species because they were a lot easier to catch, or the eggs were easier to get to, or the juveniles were easier to eat, that kind of stuff. So that was the problem with them. Then you get into things like trout, Canada goose, that kind of stuff. Game animals, basically. They brought them over. Deer.
Moose at some point.
Yeah. Well, we'll get into moose in a second.
Okay.
So those were brought over for game. Basically, straight up, just we like shooting stuff and that sort of thing. Ducks, mallard ducks were brought over for that sort of reason as well. And trout were also brought over for that as well, and salmon. Salmon were brought over for that reason as well, which is an interesting story about salmon, which I don't know if it's true. I've never been able to confirm it, but one of my mates who used to work for the Department of Conservation told me that the only translocation, or the first translocation in the world of salmon that was successful from Alaska, was to New Zealand.
Oh, wow. Okay.
And apparently they'd tried to do it multiple times to New Zealand and other places in the world, and they'd never had the blessing of the indigenous peoples where these salmon were being taken from. And none of those translocations worked. The one time that the indigenous people were brought on board and said, yep, this is cool, we're happy with this, and that sort of stuff, that was the one time that it took, and that was in New Zealand.
That's interesting,
Yeah. So again, don't know if that's true. That's what I've heard, but I thought it was a good story.
Yep.
The moose are very interesting because... that comes from down my way in Invercargill, specifically Fiordland. It's the Fiordland moose, and people swear up and down that they have seen these bloody moose in Fiordland.
I heard that,
and there is no confirmation that moose still exist. It is from what I can tell, it's kind of this weird cryptid thing, that people say it's out there, and it's kind of like New Zealand's Bigfoot almost. We don't know if the moose are still out there. I would say from my minimal research that I've seen into it, that I've looked into it, I think moose probably were brought to New Zealand. I think somebody tried to introduce them to New Zealand, and I think that at least at some point moose were in Fiordland. But I don't think they are anymore. Again, there are people who go out to Fiordland for, all sorts of things, tramps and stuff, and they swear to God they've seen moose. And people are like, yeah, well, moose are pretty big, so like, there's nothing that big in New Zealand that you could really mistake for moose. But
well, I mean, everybody's got cell phones now, so we should get some evidence at some point. But
so it's so moose is an open question as to whether they still exist. But personally, I do think they tried. I think they tried. So and the other weird cryptid one is the Marlborough puma. Which is I think that one's definitely bollocks. I think it's just a large
a black cat out there.
A large black cat. So I don't think that one's real. But the moose has a lot of credibility, and a lot of people have looked into it and tried to kind of figure out if they were actually brought over and stuff. The moose has been looked into quite a bit. And so I'm willing to stick my neck out there and say probably there is enough credible evidence there that I think somebody tried to make something happen there. But so that's a weird one.
I remember that. I mean, we American, turkey. And I just, I go out birding and I see California quail, which I'm like, oh, that's from home. Cool. You don't belong here. You're pretty, but you don't belong here,
Yeah. And there's all sorts. People have tried to bring all sorts of weird stuff to New Zealand. I think it's the Archives Twitter page has a bunch of, sometimes they just post documents that people have sent to the government, and letters that people have sent to the government throughout New Zealand's history. And a lot of them are to do with, they tried to bring hippos to New Zealand, or they tried to bring, kangaroos to New Zealand, or whatever. People try to bring really weird and really dumb stuff to New Zealand. 9 times out of 10 getting rejected. But it was, for a long time, it was the Assimilation Society's jobs to organize all of that. That's what they were doing. And the assimilation societies were the kind of precursor to the modern fishing game, which is basically the same for your American listeners, is basically the same as, I think you guys call it Fish and Wildlife or something?
Yes, Fish and Wildlife,
So basically the same thing. They manage like fishing licenses and hunting licenses and that kind of stuff. So the assimilation societies, their job was to bring over that, random animals that they thought they could release into the wild for multitude of different reasons and that sort of stuff. And then, of course, there's so that was all the purpose ones that they brought over intentionally.
Yes.
And then, of course, you get the ones that they didn't bring over unintentionally. So we've already talked about Kiori, the Pacific rat. Europeans brought over their own breeds of rats, which was the ship's rat, the black rat, and the Norway rat, the brown rat, which are very good they're even better than the Kiori at doing their job. So the Kiori actually, their population went down because the Norway rat and the ship's rat were really really good, much better than Kiori. So they ended up actually outcompeting them largely. So they're obviously a big problem in New Zealand now for the same reasons that the Kiori were. And wasps. Wasps is one that people might not know of, but Marlborough and Nelson has a really big problem with common wasps and German wasps. And they have a really big thing where not only are they horrible and everyone hates them, but also they outcompete, again, a lot of other species, including bird species like tui. Because what happens is tui like this little, I can't remember if it's off a plant or whether it's off an insect, but there's a little organism that basically sucks out the sap out of trees. And it has this little like hanger thing that's like a little tube, and out the end of this little tube they drop honeydew, which is very high sugar little syrupy thing, and the tui would come along and lick that all up, and that was a major food source for them. And wasps also really like it, and wasps will just go after it and really well. And so that was a big that's a big problem that they have with that is wasps outcompeting tui, which is a unusual interaction that I think most people aren't aware of.
No, yeah.
So that's a big one as well, is weird insects that are brought over, things like flies and stuff. You usually hear about it in terms of like horticulture. The kiwi fruit industry always has like a meltdown every time someone finds a new weird fly in Auckland. And that's, and so that's also why if any one of your listeners is from overseas and has come to New Zealand, that's why they want to open your bags and they want to look through everything, and that's why they're like, you cannot bring your muddy gumboots, we're going to burn them, that sort of stuff. So it's not because they're being like dicks, it's because if something gets in here, then it's potentially extremely bad, not just for the environment and conservation and that sort of stuff, but also like a lot of our industries and exports and stuff, it can be pretty horrific. So,
major.
So that's why New Zealand and Australia have some of the most stringent biosecurity laws in the world. Yeah, which was a bit of a revelation to me when my partner, who has just recently gone back to the States to see family and stuff, and I said, so like, is there going to be any problems you bringing some of this stuff? And she's like, no, they don't care. Nah, if I go back to America and I have mud on my shoes or I have an apple or whatever, they don't care.
No.
And I'm like, what? And they're like, no. And she's like, no, they don't even care. And I was like, no, you'd be like, if you don't declare something in New Zealand, you get slapped with like a hefty fine. They've even made entire TV shows about this, about border security in New Zealand and Australia because of how stringent our biosecurity is.
Oh, they'll pull your visa too. They'll pull it real quick.
Yeah. So they're like, they're pretty harsh about that, but for good reason. So
Well, right. So what are some of the stories, the impacts? I mean, we've covered some of the species. We talked about the Kākāpō, we talked about the tuatara, the kiwi. Yeah, these species just hanging on, and you've touched upon it, but I found the tui one fascinating, and that is one of our famous birds here. If you hear a tui call. Our dialect, right? They all have different dialects around the country. Yeah. They're beautiful birds. I love hearing them outside my home. What are some of the impacts that it just happened in the last 150 years? Yeah.
So, I mean, the big one is, I guess, habitat destruction. As I said before, Europeans were, and still are, very good at it, which is not something to be proud of. Europeans were and still are, have this industrial approach to basically economics and that sort of stuff, where no resource goes unexploited, and so a lot of it came from timber. Native trees were very good for they were very popular in building houses and furniture and exporting them to other countries that wanted our cool wood. A lot of hardwoods and things that were very, very hard to find, particularly because in a lot of cases, for England, for example, a lot of their large oak trees that are hundreds and hundreds of years old had all been cut down in the last few hundred years because they were used to build big sailing ships. And New Zealand, of course, had our own big several 100-year-old trees, and they were all cut down to build houses and export it and all that sort of stuff. So that was a big one. And then there was things like mining as well was a really big one. There was a gold rush in Otago started in the 1860s. So that was a big thing as well. And then, of course, things like coal, when that was, there's a few coal mines on the west coast of the South Island and that sort of stuff. So a lot of it is habitat destruction. There's also the cultural destruction as well of Māori was a huge thing as well, in terms of like social, cultural, economic for them as well. Religious. Te Reo Māori, the Māori language, was suppressed under the Taonga Suppression Act of 1921, I think it was, which is basically just you're not allowed to be Māori in public. You're not allowed to use Te Reo in schools. There was a lot of land that was stolen through war and conquest and that kind of stuff. Dodgy dealings as well. Very, very common to get Māori drunk and then try to make them do a deal to sell their land for not very much at all. And then there were things like the musket wars, which was intertribal conflicts due to muskets being introduced to New Zealand, which was a bit of a joke for some Europeans for a long time. They thought, wow, this is kind of funny. And then they realized, actually, this is quite bad because Māori are kind of annihilating each other and we're kind of doing nothing about it. And we're kind of partly at fault because we keep selling them guns.
Yep.
So that was a big thing as well. Then there was the New Zealand Wars, aforementioned land stolen, and the kingitanga, the Māori king movement. Māori basically realized that if they wanted to deal with the Queen, which was Queen Victoria at the time, they needed someone who was on equal footing, equal status. So they elevated one of their own to become king, which is a whole complex story in and of itself, because I say they as in all Māori, not all Māori agreed to it, not all iwi tribes agreed to it, but it was a big thing. And so there's that as well, is a lot of the cultural stuff with Māori, and it's only really been in the last sort of even 20 or 30 years that a lot of that stuff was coming back. It's only really since sort of the 90s and sort of the 80s, a lot of this kind of this Māori cultural revival is going on with, last year they put through a law that said Matariki, the Māori New Year, is now a public holiday, which this year is going to be the first year that that's actually a reality, which is amazing.
Yeah, I'm excited,
for obviously cultural reasons, but also we get a day off.
I know.
And everyone, no one can complain of a day off.
No.
So there's a lot of that as well. So a lot of, there was a lot of environmental destruction, a lot of habitat destruction, to say nothing of things like dams as well. That's a big problem. New Zealand really likes to talk about how a lot of our electricity is renewable, which for dams is not necessarily false, but they're really, really bad for blocking streams, which for migratory fish, particularly tuna, which is eels, which is very confusing if you're talking about tuna, the big fish, which we call kingfish in New Zealand. They migrate up the rivers, and now in some cases there's these huge big pieces of concrete in the way, and that's a big problem. So especially in the South Island, where 98% of the South Island's electricity is made by dams. So it's like a big thing, and so that's a big problem as well. Is how we generate our electricity. Even with there's a lot of work being done at the moment on how wind farms affect things. Basically the environment of where they're being set up and where they're being built. The jury's still kind of out on that one as to whether they're actually good or bad. So I guess to kind of round that off is New Zealand. It's very, very common for New Zealand to have this clean green image of we're so amazing and we've got all this conservation stuff and it's all going great. Not to say it's all going bad, but also New Zealand should not be put on the pedestal that a lot of marketing would have you believe.
To be fair, it's true. We do have our challenges. I was at my son's soccer game. We just started our football season here, but last year they're burning coal. In Huntley. It's 10%. I think of our power last year came from coal. So we definitely have our challenges, but compared to, back home in the States where, it's still a lot of, fracking and a lot of stuff that's going on there. And I will say they're awful, but the paper straws, me and my son the other day went to a movie and we had paper straws and he was complaining and I'm like, well, at least they're not plastic.
Yeah, exactly.
So we're leading the way in some ways, but what I do want to, because we're already out almost at an hour, what are we doing right here? Because things changed, right? It was dark. It's I just watched the movie Cousins on Netflix. If you haven't seen that, some of what the Maori have suffered, like African Americans in the States have suffered. Things have changed, and we are trying, especially to be green here, like you've said. Some green energy. What I really want to drill down to, and maybe just 5 or 10 minutes talk about this. What are we doing to save our species? Because we just talked about the Kākāpō, the island strategy. You were telling me when we spoke a couple weeks ago, his name, and I was looking for him. who came up with that. So maybe you can talk about that. Like what are we doing right that we can export around the world to help endangered species?
Yeah. So New Zealand is and has for a long time been exporting our dare I say it, pioneering techniques in conservation and species management and that kind of stuff. It is not uncommon that I have heard from people who have said that, you know, they've worked overseas, and when they tell conservationists overseas, like they put on their CV, I did conservation in New Zealand, that is considered very, very good. You know, a lot of people say actually that is some top tier cutting edge stuff. So there is a lot of stuff that we're doing. Richard Henry is the guy that you're thinking of.
That's it. Yeah.
He was a guy who is kind of considered to be the father of New Zealand conservation. A lot of the techniques that Department of Conservation use were kind of, if not invented, but were refined by him. So using dogs to sniff out animals he used it to sniff out Kākāpō is a big technique that is used now. For example, they've kind of changed it up a little bit now, where Predator-Free Wellington has recently contracted the services of, I think it's a Jack Russell, who is trained to sniff out rats and rat nests and stuff. So, you know, they've kind of taken that a little step further, and instead of looking for the things we want to pick up and protect, they're looking for the things they want to get rid of and the areas that they should target. So that's really cool. The main thing he's really known for, though, is island translocations. So he worked on Resolution Island, which is a big island down in Fiordland, which is on the southwest coast of the South Island. And he took animals from Resolution and some of the surrounding area. He took Kākāpō specifically, and he took them to Pigeon Island, which was a smaller island just off the coast of Resolution. And he put them in a little pen made of punga trees, and he basically tried to stop rats and stoats and all sorts of other things trying to get at them. And he, if you go down there, you can still see the remains of that little pen, which is really, really exciting. And so that's what he did. And he was, broadly speaking, pretty successful for the early 20th century, late 19th, early 20th century. He was doing this stuff, and he was generally pretty successful given everything that he was dealing with at the time. So that was kind of the start, I guess, of what ended up being like a lot of what Doc does. You know, Kākāpō are now translocated to all sorts of different places. Whenua, Codfish Island, is the main one that they get translocated to. The Kākāpō recovery program has now kind of extended beyond that to doing like managing genetics and stuff, which is like insane. And so there's a lot of that sort of stuff. There's also moving lots of other animals. Tuatara is probably the other big one. They're extinct on the mainland in the wild. You can still find them in places like Zealandia and that sort of stuff, but they're mostly extinct. They're only found on offshore islands. Stevens Island is probably one that's the most famous. But there's also the Brothers Islands, which are just north of the Marlborough Sounds. If you go on the Inter-Islander across the Cook Strait, you can see them pretty easily. To call them islands is probably a bit much. They're just a few rocks. But they have a particular subspecies of tuatara on them, which are very, very rare. And so, so that's translocations is a big part of that, taking things from other islands, putting them on mainland islands, which is things like Zealandia, which got big predator-proof fences, and then hopefully trying to introduce them back into the wild is kind of the end goal there. Apart from that, other things, as I said earlier at the start, trapping is the big one that I am involved with in my day job. So there's a lot of effort in trying to put out traps and catch rats, catch stoats, catch possums, which were introduced for the fur trade, which I didn't mention earlier. You know, and basically trying to get rid of those. And also poisons, using things like 1080 is the most popular one, or Brodifacoum is also a popular one for possums. Very, very controversial. A lot of people are against it for heaps of different reasons. Poison is basically, if you're dropping poison into the wild, generally not a super good idea. No. It's not something that's super good for the environment, but it's very effective and very cheap. And so there's unfortunately not great alternatives to those at the moment. Trapping is unfortunately labor intensive. You have to be able to get out to those areas where you want to to trap, and depending on what kind of trap you've got, you have to reset them every couple of weeks and that sort of stuff. But there's a lot of kind of to their end, the government is putting in a lot of money into new technologies. So some of them are things like biodegradable single-use traps that can be dropped from a helicopter. Some of them are things like AI that can be used to recognize on cameras, like when there's a possum on screen, because at the moment they just have to, it's a motion sensor camera, right? If a leaf moves, it starts recording, and someone has to go through all that footage.
Yep. The
hope is that they'll be able to develop this AI to recognize that's a possum on screen. Real person should look at this. That's just a leaf. Don't bother with that. So it's even just stuff like that is really, really interesting to how we might get better at doing conservation, even if it's not, it's not directly trying to get rid of introduced predators, but it's helping us getting to be more effective at doing that.
Well, it does work. I since I've started this podcast, and that's, the moving to New Zealand was what kicked me into high gear to start our podcast. And I remember walking, talking to Angie about this from Florida, where I walk outside and it is a chorus of insects and birds and, birds and insects mainly, some animals. Yep. And then going through parts of New Zealand where it's just dead, no insects, barely any birds. It's just, it seems like a dead biome. Then where I go to areas like Parongia near where I live, I love Sanctuary Mountain. It's another predator-proof area. And it's alive. The biome is alive. There's a lot of birds. I see some insects. It's thriving. So this strategy works. It's controversial, but it works. And unfortunately for the introduced mammals or predators, they're devastating. They're absolutely devastating to the biome.
Yeah, it's a weird thing in my line of work where people will send me pictures of dead rats and go, "Yeah, I got one."
I know.
And it's a bit grim in general, but it is also a bit sort of when I talk to other people about it and be like, "Oh, it's really exciting, we kill rats," and they're like, "Oh no, that's kind of not really into that." So it is I don't want people to think that I revel in the death of animals. I certainly don't. No. But it is a necessary evil, unfortunately. It is we get a lot of people that ask, like, you shouldn't be doing this. You should just let the rats, be out in nature. And the fact of the matter is, it's the rats or it's the birds.
Yeah.
We cannot have both. We have to pick one. We have chosen the birds because they were naturally here. They were already here. It was our fault that the rats came over. So we're trying to get rid of them, basically. So it's so it's not something that anyone really necessarily wants to do, but it's something that we have to do if we want to preserve those, the birds and the insects and the reptiles and the fish and all that sort of stuff. So that's so that's a big thing. But there's a lot of work being done in those areas. Basically, the ultimate goal that the government has set was predator-free 2050. They want to be predator-free by the year 2050. There are some caveats to that. What they mean by predator-free is rats, mustelids, and possums are no longer on New Zealand, which is a very lofty goal in and of itself. There are something like 40 million possums out in New Zealand's bush, which, to put that into context, is about 10 times the human population. Yeah. So
I didn't know we had that many.
So to be fair, that statistic is a few years old now. Yeah. So it might not be accurate, but that's roughly what we're looking at. All right. And of course, and Stoats probably is roughly the same. Rats is probably double, even maybe triple that. So that's the goal, is to be predator free. There are still things like cats, household cats. New Zealand has the highest cat ownership per capita in the world, and they go out and they hunt birds, native birds, and that sort of thing. So, it's not a, I guess you could say, it's not totally what they're saying it is. Yeah. It's not predator free. We're not predator free. We're not going to be predator free by 2050 in that respect. And if I'm being 100% totally honest, I think what you're probably going to find is that goal of even getting rid of those 3 species
is going to be very tough.
Is very difficult. And what is most likely going to happen is the government at the time of 2050 are probably just going to move the goalposts and say, we did it. Yeah. When actually they did not achieve the goal that they originally set. In saying that, that's not, you always see nature docos and they're always really depressing. That's not to say that some good work is not being done. Yeah. A lot of community groups are doing some really fantastic work, kind of to your point about, going out into areas where there's lots of birdsong and stuff. Mm-hmm. And I have the privilege of being able to work with a lot of community groups, just neighbors that have banded together and said, we're going to protect our little bit of forest.
Yep.
And they say, first year we didn't hear anything. Even like 6 months to a year later, after we started trapping rats and stoats and possums and whatever else, we started hearing tui and we started hearing kaka, or we started hearing Kākāpō, bellbirds, if they're really lucky, and that sort of stuff. They start hearing things. They start seeing fantails and that kind of stuff. So there's a lot of really cool work being done with community groups, because unfortunately the Department of Conservation does not have enough money to do all this stuff.
I know.
So they have started relying on community groups to kind of help them and do it for them.
And they're doing it.
Yeah, and they definitely are. Yeah. But I think if there's anything that I would stress to people, not just in New Zealand, but all across the world, if you want to get involved in this kind of stuff, if you want to try and do your bit for conservation or the environment or whatever, find a local community group. Find a group of people that are doing something that you're interested in. Doesn't have to be with animals. There's a lot of groups out there that are just doing weeding for New Zealand, like things like gorse and old man's beard. Mm-hmm. There's entire groups that just do that. It's really crap work, but someone has to do it. And a lot of the time, I know a lot of people, when they go out and they volunteer their time for these groups, what generally happens is the volunteers get burnt out really quickly. These community groups rip through volunteers like nothing else, because a lot of people don't really realize what's required, the effort that is necessary to maintain these trap networks, to maintain this weeding program and that kind of stuff. So my advice would be, if you want to get involved with these community groups, one, know what you're getting yourself into. It's going to be hard work. But also, even if you can't offer your hands in physically doing manual labor, you, for whatever reason, you may not be able or may not be capable of doing that kind of work, that's totally fine. These people, these groups also need all sorts of skill sets. They need treasurers, they need planners, they need people who can organize, who can do logistics. They need people who can market for them, that are good at social media. They need that kind of stuff. So just because you can't get involved in the manual labor doesn't mean you can't be helpful.
Right.
So that's something that I would stress, is a lot of people think volunteering means manual labor. Volunteering also means you can use your brain if you're not very good with your hands, which, like me, I'm not very good with my hands, but my brain seems to do okay. So that's a big thing as well. Yeah. But another thing you can do, if you don't even want to get involved with the group directly, is these people also need money. And by that, I mean, you don't have to donate money. We're all poor. There's a cost of living crisis going on. I appreciate that. Yeah. Your bosses are really rich, though. I can almost guarantee that. So try and convince your bosses. Try and convince the people that you work for to sponsor these people. If it's not through monetary means, through the donation of gear, through the donation of sponsoring maybe competitions or raffles or, goods and services. Things like, not that many people will work for helicopter companies, but, a lot of helicopter companies in the South Island offer their services for free to groups that want to get out into remote areas, and that's a good thing that they do. There's a company in Fiordland that do boat tours throughout Fiordland. And they offer a lot of time and money to use of that boat for conservation purposes. So again, just because you can't get involved directly doesn't mean you can't hit up your boss and be like, hey, do you want to maybe sponsor this thing that could be really good? Particularly if you spin it in such a way that it's like, this will look really good.
Yeah, it's good PR.
For you.
It's really good PR. It's really good PR.
So that I guess is the takeaway, is that I know I've been particularly negative.
No, not really. And it's a reality check too, though. I mean, we do our best to be positive, and tell the good stories. And playing devil's advocate in New Zealand is doing a lot of good. But you're right. Like I said, I was out there smelling the coal burning behind me, going, "What is this?" It's been years since I've smelt that. But it is. You make a great point. I think that's a great way to end this discussion today. Mm-hmm. I think we should do, Angie and I in the next year, we'll do Australian possum and have you back, and we could talk about that.
Yeah, the possum is an interesting one.
Yeah.
I wrote a whole bunch of stuff. I knew this was going to happen. I wrote a whole bunch of stuff, and we haven't gone over it.
No,
that's okay.
It's fascinating.
I talk a lot.
No, it's great. It's so
great.
So
I mean, if there's anything else you want to know, about that kind of stuff, more than happy to come on, because there's a lot going on in New Zealand conservation. There's a lot going on with species recovery and that sort of stuff.
Yeah, we'll have to have you back on.
I don't want to get people down. There is good news.
There is,
but we definitely we can't have the good news without the bad news. So.
Yeah. Well, I told you I just moved, and I literally had lived in this place for 2 years, and I just heard a tui for the first time.
Yeah,
a couple weeks ago outside my window. I had not heard one in 2 years. At the gardens here, I hear them all the time, but they're obviously pushing out.
Yeah, and that's a big thing. Is kind of 10, 15, 20 years ago, tui, and at least in Wellington, which is where I live, basically unheard of in the middle of the city.
Yeah.
Now I can't walk down the street with the bloody things yelling
at
me. So, that's really good.
Yeah. Final question. The History of Aotearoa New Zealand podcast. Mm-hmm. Subscribe, download it. 20, 25-minute episodes. They're easy to digest. I'm like, oh my God, it's already over, and I got to quickly download the next one.
Yeah, it is. It's a trade-off.
No, it's great though. It's
people
quick.
Like the short. Yeah, sort of thing. So that's worked. But yeah, it does. I have had a few people that are like, I really want them to be longer because I want more. And it's
it's fascinating. That's a good thing. That's a good thing. It's a good thing. Where can our listeners learn more about you, your podcast, or any social media you'd like to mention?
Yeah, so I'm on most social media. I'm on Twitter at History Aotearoa, Instagram History of Aotearoa New Zealand Podcast, Facebook History of Aotearoa New Zealand Podcast. And my website is historyaotearoa.com. So that's got all the podcast episodes on it. And of course, you can find the podcast. If you're listening to this, you've probably already got some sort of podcatcher. So just use that. Whatever that is, I'll be on it probably. If I'm not, flick me an email or at me on Twitter or whatever. I'll go talk to them and tell them to put me on there. But yeah, I'm in most places. Yeah, as you said, sort of roughly 20-minute episodes of New Zealand history, mostly at the moment pre-European Māori. So if that's something that you're interested in, there's nearly 80-something episodes on that. Mm-hmm. And there's a few episodes on various other things. By the time this comes out, I will have started, or just about be starting, a big series on Speight's, which is a beer brand in New Zealand, the history of Speight's, and what they were up to and all about. And that covers a lot of things like prohibition in New Zealand, women's suffrage, and cross-sex with a lot of interesting places in New Zealand. So that's, I guess, I'm taking a bit of a break at the moment from pre-European Māori society to do that, because I had a stroke of inspiration and just went for it. So if that's something that you're into, if you're interested in New Zealand's history, what's going on, and you're interested in it having a conservation or natural history slant, my podcast, History of Aotearoa New Zealand, might be something that you're interested in.
I highly recommend it. I absolutely do. It's fascinating to talk to you, Thomas. I cannot wait to get down to Wellington, or if you come up my way, we definitely would go have a beer or something and get some coffee and chat more. But thank you so much for coming on. Thomas Rhillstone, History of Aotearoa New Zealand podcast. Fascinating talk. obviously this one went long. I could have gone for another hour easily.
Yeah, I had a lot more notes. So
we'll do it again.
If there's demand, maybe we'll do another one.
Yeah, for sure. But cheers, and thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you very much for having me. It was great.